The morning was still wrapped in mist when I first heard the laughter. It rolled over the lake like a cruel echo, bouncing between trees that had once shaded my family's picnics. Our laughter, our memories. But this time, the sound carried something different, sharper, colder. It wasn't the joy of a child's mischief or the giggle of the summer play. It was mockery, and it was aimed at me. Welcome to a story that drips with silence and memory, a story of loyalty, of being pushed too far, and of reclaiming dignity when no one thinks you have the strength left to do so. If you're someone who's ever been made to feel invisible in your own family, I ask you to stay with me a while. Perhaps this will echo somewhere in your heart. If you find something in these words that tugs at your chest, I gently invite you to subscribe to this quiet corner of the internet, a space where stories like mine are finally heard. Whether you're watching from Boston or Brisbane, from a bustling city or a quiet room at midnight, thank you. Let me ask, where are you listening from? And more importantly, have you ever imagined what it feels like to drown, not in water, but in the betrayal of someone you once cradled in your arms? My name is Edith. I'm 73 years old. I'm a widow, a retired school librarian, and I live in upstate New York, just outside a sleepy town that smells like damp leaves, pine wood, and lately, something lonelier. My little house sits on the edge of a lake my husband and I once called our heaven. Gerald and I used to say this place was a secret pocket of peace sewn into the madness of the world, a place where time slowed down and the only loud sound was laughter at Sunday dinners. But the years, as they tend to do, frayed those stitches. Gerald's been gone 7 years now. I still keep his photo by the fireplace, beside a ceramic duck he always claimed was hideous, but which he never had the heart to throw away. The couch still sags in his shape, and his slippers, well, they've gathered dust. And yet, some mornings, I still reach for 2 cups of coffee before I remember. Funny, the habit's grief keeps alive. I have 1 daughter, Marlene, and 1 grandson, Carter. Marlene had Carter young, and they both lived with me for years. We were close once. Carter used to trail behind me with jelly on his chin and puzzles in his hands, calling me Nana, like it was the most sacred word he knew. I taught him how to skip stones, how to hold his breath underwater, how to spell extraordinary. Back then, I believed love like that would never turn. I believed he'd remember the stories, the bedtimes, the lake. But people change. And somewhere along the way, so did Carter. Marlene moved out when Carter was 10, married a man who wore cologne like armor and spoke in dismissals. His name was Rick, but he always told me to call him Richard, like being formal would erase the stench of his arrogance. He never liked me. Said I was too soft on Carter, too involved. Said I hovered like a sad little helicopter. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to lose my daughter, but over time I began to lose her anyway. They stopped visiting as often. Holidays turned into phone calls, then just texts, then silence. And Carter, my bright-eyed boy with the endless questions, he started replying with one-word answers, then none at all. It wasn't until my 73rd birthday that I saw them again, all of them. Marlene, Richard, Carter. They drove up in a new SUV that looked like a spaceship and parked on the gravel like they were tourists at a museum. Marlene wore a designer coat and eyes that didn't linger. Richard stepped in like he owned the place. And Carter, he was 19 now, taller than me, broader, a jawline that caught shadows. But his eyes, they were unfamiliar, flat, cold. I told myself maybe he was just tired. Maybe college had changed him. Maybe I hadn't called enough. Guilt is an expert at making excuses. We sat by the lake that afternoon. I made lemonade and peach cobbler, his favorite. He barely touched it, said he didn't do sugar anymore, said lakes were gross. I laughed, trying to shake it off. Told him he used to beg me to stay out there with him until his fingers turned to raisins. He shrugged and looked at his phone. That's when it started to settle in. The terrible recognition that I was no longer his safe place. I was a pit stop, an obligation, a relic of a life he'd already buried. The final blow came when I asked him if he remembered the story of the turtle we rescued, the one stuck in a soda ring. We'd cried together that day. But now, when I brought it up, Carter rolled his eyes and said, "God, Nana, that was like 100 years ago. You're always so dramatic." I looked out at the lake. It sparkled like it always had, completely unaware of how much had changed. That's when Carter stood up, walked toward the dock, and said, "Come on, Nana. You can still swim, right?" I hesitated. Something in his voice didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like a test. Still, I followed. I thought maybe he was softening. Maybe this was his awkward way of making a memory. I didn't see the shove coming. One moment, I was adjusting my sweater. The next, air, then water, then silence. The cold slammed into me like a wall. My ears filled, my chest seized, and the world turned green and blurry. I flailed, my limbs moving slower than they used to, my legs tangled in weeds. Panic clutched me. I gasped and swallowed lake water instead of air. Above me, I heard laughter again. Not concerned, not surprised, just laughter. Then his voice, casual, detached. "Don't be so dramatic, Nana." I was drowning, and he thought it was a joke. I wanted to scream, to reach up and pull myself to the dock, but my body was tired, and betrayal is a weight no one teaches you how to swim with. In that moment, something inside me broke, but something else lit up. I survived. But that moment, it changed everything. I don't remember the exact moment I broke the surface. Everything had blurred into murky panic, and then air, bitter, cold air that sliced across my lungs like glass. My arms shook as I clung to the edge of the dock, nails scraping wet wood while my heart punched against my ribs. I didn't look up immediately. I couldn't. Not because I was weak, but because I knew what I'd see. Laughter, disinterest, maybe even boredom. What I needed in that moment was a hand. What I got was Carter, standing at the edge of the dock, filming something on his phone. I finally managed to drag myself up, half-drenched, coughing lake water, my sweater clinging like a second skin. The shore blurred as my glasses slipped from my nose and dropped into the lake. I heard the splash, but didn't look back for them. Instead, I turned my face toward my grandson and met his expression. Flat, unbothered. Not a shred of guilt or concern, just a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "You really can swim," he said. I was kind of wondering. Behind him, Marlene stood near the picnic table, arms folded, face unreadable. Richard had his phone in hand, as if replying to some business email was more urgent than watching a soaked 73-year-old woman drag herself from a near-death experience. "Are you okay, Mom?" Marlene finally asked, though her voice lacked any urgency, as if she were reading from a teleprompter. I didn't answer. Not at first. Because the question felt wrong. It wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "What happened to you? Who pushed you? Why did my son think it was funny?" But she didn't ask any of those things. She just watched me like I was the one overreacting. Like maybe I'd slipped. I sat down on the bench by the boathouse, trying to stop my hands from trembling. My body was cold, but the ache in my chest wasn't from water. It was from clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't arrive in sudden shocks, but rather creeps up and settles in your bones like a long, unwanted winter. I'd spent years telling myself that time and love would bring Carter back to me, that boys become distant, but they always remember who held them when they cried over scraped knees or sat through hours of their dinosaur facts. But I saw no flicker of that boy now. I saw only a young man shaped by ridicule, entitlement, and the hollow charm of performance. He had become someone else. Marlene didn't sit beside me. Instead, she busied herself packing up the untouched food, wrapping foil around dishes like sealing away the awkwardness would somehow erase it. Richard muttered something about traffic. And Carter? He'd already posted a photo of the lake to his social media. No caption, just filtered blue water, and a comment from one of his friends saying, Looks peaceful, Af. I didn't speak much the rest of the afternoon. I let them talk over me, around me, past me. I let them pretend nothing had happened. When they finally left, Marlene kissed my cheek, her lips dry and rushed. Carter waved without looking. As their SUV pulled away, I stood on the porch, dripping slightly, my hair still damp despite the towel I'd wrapped around my shoulders. I watched the tires kick up dust and knew that something inside me had shifted. I spent that evening alone, wrapped in Gerald's robe, nursing a lukewarm cup of peppermint tea. The wind outside rustled the maple leaves, and for the first time in years, the house felt like it was whispering back to me. Not sadness, not silence, but resolve. Over the next few days, I found myself combing through old letters, journals, documents. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for clarity. I needed to see where I'd gone wrong, what I'd missed, what I'd ignored. And the truth was, I'd excused far too much. When Marlene first married Richard, he had insisted she cut the cord. I remember that phrase exactly. He'd used it over dinner, laughing as he said, "It's time she stops being your little girl and becomes my wife." I'd smiled then, a tight smile, and poured more gravy. But inside, something had wilted. Then came the phone calls that were shorter, the holidays spent with Richard's family instead, the awkward silences when I'd ask if Carter could spend a weekend with me. Each time the answer was some version of, "He's busy," or "We've got plans." I let those small cuts go. I bandaged them with love. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that life was just busy. But the lake incident, that was no accident. That was a culmination. A child doesn't grow cold overnight. He's taught. And Carter had been taught that I didn't matter. Still, part of me hoped it was a one-time lapse in judgment, that maybe he'd call, apologize, feel something. But he didn't. Days passed, then a week. Not a single word. I tried to occupy my time. I replanted my herb garden, cleaned the attic, took long walks around the lake with my cane tapping the dirt path, a steady reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still standing. Then one afternoon, while sorting through Gerald's old paperwork, I stumbled on something I hadn't seen in years, our property deed. It was tucked inside a leather folder, wrapped in ribbon. His handwriting was scrawled on a sticky note stuck to the front. "Never let them take what you bled for." I sat there, eyes brimming, the lake glinting through the window behind me, and in that moment, something unspoken finally took shape. I'd spent so long mourning the family I used to have that I hadn't realized how much power still remained in the woman I was. I didn't need revenge. I needed protection from further pain, from watching my legacy rot in the hands of people who didn't value it. That night, I pulled out a notepad and began writing. Not a letter, not a will, not yet, just thoughts, steps, plans. Because if they could shove me into a lake and laugh, if they could let me drown in both water and disregard, then I had every right to swim back with a different kind of strength. One they hadn't seen before, one they'd never believe I still had. They thought I was fragile. They mistook silence for weakness. But I was still Edith, and I had watched the world turn its back on me more than once. But this time I was going to turn first, and when I did, I wouldn't be looking back. The next morning, I opened the kitchen curtains and let the sunlight in without flinching. It poured across the counters, over the worn-out toaster and the ceramic jar labeled tea that had never held tea, only coins and rubber bands. The house smelled like lemons and wood polish, and for the first time in years, I didn't start my day with a silent prayer for reconciliation. I started it with a list. I had already decided. If my family saw me as disposable, then I would no longer shape my life around their comfort. It wasn't revenge I craved. It was distance, protection, dignity. I had no intention of becoming the forgotten old woman who paid for everything and got nothing but silence and cruelty in return. They had made their choices, and now I would make mine. First, I called my lawyer, Thomas Briggs. He was in his early 50s now, but he had been fresh out of law school when Gerald and I first hired him to help with our property paperwork. He remembered me immediately and asked how Gerald was. I paused, and with a calm I hadn't felt in ages, I told him, "Gone, but I think he'd be proud of me today." There was a pause, then a gentle chuckle on the other end. "Let's talk, Edith," he said. "Come in tomorrow." That day, I took out every document I could find: the deed to the lakefront property, the old joint accounts that I'd never bothered to close, the will Gerald and I had drafted years ago when Carter still had chubby cheeks and couldn't pronounce his R's. I laid them all on the dining table like puzzle pieces from another life. The sheer volume of it surprised me. I'd forgotten how much we'd built together, how carefully Gerald had ensured that everything would one day go to our daughter and grandson. But Gerald hadn't lived to see them become strangers. He hadn't watched Carter film his own grandmother struggling for breath while laughing like it was content. And that changed everything. I spent the rest of the day rereading our will, crossing things out with a pen, not legally, of course, but symbolically. I imagined Gerald's voice as I did it. "What's yours, Edie," he used to say, "until they earn it." The next day, I dressed carefully. A navy blue dress I'd worn to Carter's 8th grade graduation. One of the last moments I remembered feeling proud of him. I slipped on my pearls. They were fake, but they made me feel held together. I dabbed a bit of lavender oil behind my ears, and then I walked into town, not with a walker or a cane, just my bag, my list, and a heart that felt heavier and lighter all at once. Thomas was kind, but I could see the concern in his eyes when I explained what had happened. I left out the part about nearly drowning, not because I wanted to protect Carter, but because I didn't want pity. I only told him the truth that mattered. My family has changed. They've become people I no longer trust. I want to rewrite everything. I want to secure my estate in a way that leaves nothing for them unless I choose it. He nodded slowly, adjusting his glasses. "We can do that," he said. "It's your right." So we did. Over the next 2 weeks, I legally rewrote my will. I created a trust that redirected my assets away from Carter and Marlene. I set up health directives and appointed Thomas's office as executor to avoid family interference. I added a clause that barred any party who contested my wishes from receiving assent. And then I made one last quiet decision. I wrote a private letter, not to be opened until after my passing, explaining exactly why I had changed everything. But the legal steps were only one part of the process. The other was emotional. I had to untangle myself from years of guilt, from believing that motherhood meant endless forgiveness, that grandmotherhood meant self-erasure. I had believed that if I just stayed patient, love would return, that they'd see me, need me, value me, but they hadn't, and the lake had made that crystal clear. During this time, the phone didn't ring, not once. Carter didn't check in. Marlene didn't send an email, not even a forwarded chain letter or a happy photo from Instagram. I followed her quietly. Her account was public. I saw photos of her at brunch, holding up glasses of champagne next to Carter, who now wore expensive shoes and posed like he belonged in magazines. Their captions were full of smiles, blessed family, grateful hearts. Not once did they mention me. I had become a ghost until they needed something again, and I knew eventually they would. Whether it was the lake house, a quick signature on a loan application, or a place to retreat when their shiny world cracked at the seams. That's when I decided to take one final step. I placed the house in a separate trust, tied to a local environmental charity that Gerald had loved, one that worked to protect lakes and forests across New York. After my passing, the house would become a rest and retreat center for widows, a quiet place for women like me who had spent their lives giving and had nowhere left to go. They could stay for free, right Read, rest, heal. It felt right. It felt like purpose. A few days after the paperwork was finalized, I received a message from Marlene. It was short. "Hey, Mom. Thinking of coming up next weekend. Carter's got a few friends he wants to bring. Hope that's okay." No apology. No acknowledgement of the lake incident. No warmth. Just entitlement. I stared at the message for a long while. I could have responded with a cold no. I could have ignored it. But instead, I typed back, "The lake's closed. So am I." I turned off my phone. Later that week, I bought myself something small, a lavender plant in a ceramic pot shaped like a duck. Gerald would have laughed. "You and your ducks, Edie," he'd say. But I didn't need his voice to smile. I could feel it in the quiet, a kind of approval that didn't need words. I began going to the local bookshop again, started attending a poetry club on Thursday nights. I even got a part-time job at the library, just shelving books and sipping tea in the back office with the other retired ladies who spoke softly and carried powerful stories of their own. Stories of abandonment, of strength, of quiet decisions made without drama, just resolve. One of them, a woman named Lorraine, told me her son hadn't spoken to her in 12 years. "I stopped crying after year 3, she said. "After that, I started traveling." We laughed, and I saw a glimmer of myself in her, not in the pain, but in the continuation. One afternoon, I walked down to the lake alone. The dock was still there, weathered and gray. I stepped onto it carefully this time, no trembling in my legs. The water was calm, the wind gentle. I stood at the edge and looked down, not with fear, but with memory. The reflection that looked back at me was still Edith, just a little older, a little wiser, and no longer willing to be pushed into any more cold water by people who had forgotten what love looked like. I took a smooth stone from my pocket, one Carter had given me when he was 5. He'd said it was magic, that it would keep me safe. I tossed it gently into the lake. It landed with a soft plunk. No drama, no ripple of regret, just a release. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was simply finished. And the call came just after sunrise on a Wednesday. I was in the kitchen humming to myself as I prepared oatmeal with cinnamon and apple slices. A comfort meal, simple but grounding. The air was quiet except for the soft clink of spoon against ceramic. The sun filtered through the lace curtains in threads of pale gold, warming the floor where my cat, Niblet, lay stretched and asleep. Everything felt still, peaceful. The kind of morning that reminds you life can be sweet in the smallest ways. Then the phone rang. I let it buzz twice before answering. I had learned, finally, that not every sound demanded immediate attention, especially not from people who had forgotten how to speak with kindness. But this time, I recognized the number. It was Marlene. "Hi, Mom," she said quickly, her voice tight and breathy, like someone speaking while pacing. "So, something happened. I really need you. Can we come up for a few days?" She didn't elaborate. She didn't apologize. There was no warmth, no hesitation, only a rehearsed tone of casual necessity, the way people speak to hotel clerks when they assume availability. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Well, Carter's having a bit of a situation with school. It's been stressful. He needs space to regroup. And Richard and I, we just thought maybe some fresh air might help. You know, the lake, the quiet, that sort of thing." I could practically hear her trying to sell the idea to herself. "Just for the weekend," she added quickly. "It would really mean a lot." I let the silence hang for a moment, spoon still resting in the bowl, my heart not racing, not even rising, just quiet, just clear. "Marlene," I said softly, "the lake house isn't open anymore." She paused. "What do you mean?" "It's no longer available to family stays. It's been designated for something else." A longer pause now. "Wait, what do you mean? You said I'd always be able to bring Carter there." "I said that back when Carter was someone else." There was a beat of silence so heavy I could almost feel it pressing into my ribs. "You're punishing us?" Her voice cracked slightly, the way it used to when she was a teenager and didn't get her way. "Is this about that stupid lake thing? Mom, you know he was just messing around. He didn't mean anything." "You weren't there when I came up coughing water, Marlene. You were wrapping cobbler in foil, and your son was laughing." She sighed, long, theatrical. "You're being dramatic." That phrase, those exact words again, landed like a slap. I looked out the window, past the trees, to the lake now hidden behind them. "I'm being clear," I said, my voice as steady as a shoreline. "You've all made it very clear how little I mean to you. I'm simply matching your effort." She stammered something, but I didn't catch it. I had already set the phone down gently, letting her voice fade into the room like an old song I no longer needed to hear. That weekend, they didn't come. No car in the driveway, no suitcase wheels on the porch. And strangely, the silence didn't ache the way it used to. It felt like affirmation. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A week later, I received a certified envelope from a real estate agency I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal letter, a purchase inquiry. Someone wanted to buy the lake house. The offer was generous, too generous, considering the state of the siding and the fact that half the plumbing still sang when the heat kicked in. But I recognized the buyer's name. Not Carter's, not Marlene's, Richard's. I let out a soft, tired laugh. So that was the next move. A backdoor attempt to reclaim what they'd once assumed would be theirs. They couldn't apologize. They couldn't even face me. But they were still trying to lay claim. I didn't respond to the offer. I didn't need to. The trust was already in place. Legally, they couldn't buy it. Not from me. Not from anyone. The lake house's future was sealed. Not with vengeance, but with preservation. Still, I couldn't help but feel the heat in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Not sadness, either. Just a kind of quiet resolve hardening further into stone. A few days later, Lorraine from the poetry group invited me to a weekend retreat just outside of Hudson, a gathering of women over 60 who shared stories, made art, and cooked together under old oak trees. I said yes immediately. I packed 2 sweaters, 3 notebooks, and the cheap fountain pen Gerald once gave me that always leaked just a little. That weekend, I sat around fires with strangers who felt like sisters. One had buried a son. Another had left an abusive marriage at 72. One had been homeless after a corporate layoff and now taught dance in nursing homes. Their stories weren't all tragic, but they were real, raw, unpolished. And sitting with them, I finally said it out loud. "My grandson tried to drown me," I said, voice cracking just slightly, and my daughter acted like it was a bad party trick. No one gasped. No one clutched pearls. One woman nodded slowly like she'd heard worse. Another passed me a cup of cocoa. That was it. No pity, just presence. And in that moment, I felt more seen than I had in years. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox. This one handwritten. It was from Carter. The handwriting was messy, impatient. It wasn't long. "Nana, I don't know what your problem is. You've always made things bigger than they are. I didn't mean to push you like that. It was a joke. Everyone jokes like that. But you've got this whole thing twisted, and now Mom's crying, and Dad's furious, and everyone thinks I'm some monster. Just drop it, okay? You're making things worse." I folded the letter in half, then again, then once more. And I slid it into the drawer next to the fireplace, the one that used to hold thank you cards and dried rose petals. I didn't burn it. I didn't respond. I simply put it away. That evening, I wrote in my own notebook, not a reply, but a story, about a woman who once loved a boy with sticky fingers and dirt-covered knees, a boy who used to call her Nana Banana and steal cookies when she wasn't looking, a boy who used to say, "Don't ever die, okay? I need you forever." And then I wrote about how that boy disappeared, about how she mourned him, about how she learned to stop waiting for him to come back. That night, the lake was still, not glassy, not dramatic, just still. I stood on the porch with a shawl wrapped around my shoulders and looked out at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't sigh. I just stood there, remembering, reclaiming, and remaining. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized I wasn't just surviving. I was becoming something new. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, just as a pale band of light began to stretch across the lake. The fog lingered low over the water, clinging to the surface like breath on a cold mirror. I made my coffee slower than usual, the kind of slow where each sound becomes a companion. The click of the kettle, the rustle of curtains, the creak of the floorboards that Gerald once promised to fix but never did. I didn't rush. I didn't feel the need to. That peace, that stillness, it wasn't a performance or a shield anymore. It had become part of me. A kind of quiet that settles in only after you've stopped begging people to understand you. That's what it meant now, not silence, but self-respect. Later that afternoon, I received another unexpected envelope in the mail, but this one wasn't from Richard's real estate lawyer or Marlene's passive-aggressive attempts at reconnection. It was from the Board of Trustees of the environmental organization I had signed the property over to. The director, a soft-spoken man named Colby, whom I had met only once, had sent a kind note thanking me again for my gift and outlining how the foundation planned to begin restoring the dock and shoreline by spring. They were going to install benches, build a reading pavilion shaded by oak trees, add a garden dedicated to the memory of Gerald, with a small plaque bearing his name and a quote I had chosen. "In silence, the soul begins to bloom." I ran my fingers across the words and felt something close to joy rise in my chest. It wasn't the kind of joy that makes you want to sing or shout, but the kind that makes you sit a little straighter in your chair, that makes you feel like you didn't live in vain. I didn't need Carter to validate me. I didn't need Marlene to wake up one day and suddenly become the daughter I used to imagine she'd be. I had my name, my hands, my story, and now I had a legacy not tied to blood but to intention. But the peace was soon interrupted, not from within, but from the outside. That Friday evening, just before dusk, a car pulled into my driveway. I didn't recognize it at first. Sleek, dark gray, and far too expensive to belong to anyone I normally associated with warmth. I peeked through the front curtain. It was Marlene, and she wasn't alone. Carter was in the passenger seat. I didn't open the door immediately. I waited, not out of fear or hesitation, but to see how long it would take for them to come to the door instead of honking or calling. And sure enough, a few seconds later, Marlene stepped out and made her way to the porch. Carter stayed in the car, his arms folded, his face turned toward the woods. When I opened the door, I didn't offer a smile. I simply stepped aside. Marlene looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes tired, the edges of her makeup slightly smudged. She didn't speak until we were both seated in the front room. "Mom," she began, her voice already cracking. "I know you're angry, and I know I haven't been the daughter you deserve, but Carter's going through something. He's been suspended from school. There was a video, some party. Something stupid, he said. It blew up. The school is reviewing his scholarship. He's spiraling." I said nothing. She looked at me, waiting for the soft nod of maternal sympathy she had always counted on, even when her voice dripped with condescension. But I kept my hands folded in my lap. "I know the lake house is off limits," she continued. "But could he stay just for a few days, just to get away from everything? Please, Mom. He's still your grandson." I looked past her, out the window. The trees were bare now. The last of autumn's color had fallen, and the wind was shifting into something colder. I thought about that day on the dock, about the laughter, the cold, the ache in my bones when no one moved to help me. "Marlene," I said gently, "the house no longer belongs to me." She blinked. "What?" "I gave it to a trust. It's no longer mine, or yours, or Carter's." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "But you can undo that, right? It's your name." "No," I interrupted, softly but firmly. "I chose this because I needed to protect the one thing that still gave me peace. I won't let it be tainted by selfishness." Her voice began to rise, but I raised my hand. "Please don't yell in my home." She swallowed hard. "You're really choosing strangers over your own family?" "I'm choosing myself," I said, for the first time in decades. We sat there in silence. Outside, Carter still hadn't moved from the passenger seat. I wondered briefly if he was crying or texting or just waiting to be told what would happen next, the same way he always had. "He's just a boy," Marlene whispered. "No," I said. "He's a man now. A man who pushed his grandmother into a lake and laughed while she flailed. A man who has yet to say the words, 'I'm sorry.' That isn't a boy, Marlene. That's a man who's made a choice." She stood up, her hands shaking. "You've changed." "No," I said, standing too. "I finally stopped changing for you." She walked to the door and paused. "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I watched her leave, the gravel crunching under her boots, the wind catching the edges of her coat. When the car pulled away, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel relief. I felt something stronger. Sureness. That night, I lit a candle and sat by the fireplace, the shadows dancing on the walls. I pulled out a fresh page from my journal and wrote, "There is a peace that comes only after you give yourself permission to stop hoping for change that will never come." Then, as if summoned by that release, the wind outside settled. The branches stopped tapping against the glass. The lake, unseen in the dark, felt calm, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I hadn't lost a family. I had escaped one. The snow arrived early that December, falling in quiet sheets over the lake like a long-held sigh finally being released. From my front porch, I watched as the shoreline vanished beneath a blanket of white, and the last of the brown leaves gave in to gravity and floated gently to the ground. The water, once cold and restless, now seemed at peace, still, steady, and unknowable. Much like myself, since that final confrontation with Marlene, the world has become quieter, but not in the way that once left me aching. It is the kind of quiet that makes room for breath, for thought, for restoration. Days pass with a gentler rhythm now, shaped not by expectations or disappointments, but by my own choosing. I wake when the sun creeps softly through my curtains, not because I'm waiting for anyone's call. I read by the fire with a warm shawl around my shoulders, not to distract myself from sadness, but simply because I enjoy the feeling of soft pages and silence wrapping around me. The lake house, though technically no longer mine, still feels like an extension of who I am. I visit it often, walking the path Gerald once cleared with his hands and patience, sitting on the new bench that bears his name, and sometimes placing a thermos of tea on the armrest beside me as if he might join me again. The foundation has begun work on the retreat program, and just last week I received a packet filled with design sketches, schedules, and a welcome letter template I had been asked to write. They wanted me to write the first words that each woman would read upon arriving. Something comforting, something strong. And I did. I wrote from a place I hadn't visited in years, a place not of grief, but of purpose. I told them that this house was once built on love, lost to betrayal, and reclaimed by truth. I told them that no matter what had led them here, abandonment, widowhood, silence, cruelty, this would be a place where they would never again have to apologize for taking up space. It felt like the most important thing I've ever written. Around town, a few people have heard bits and pieces of what happened with my family. Some offer quiet condolences. Others look away. But there's a small group, mostly women, mostly older, who smile when they see me. Not out of pity, but out of recognition, as if they too have stood in the shadow of people who only knew how to take. As if they understand what it costs to walk away without a final scream or shattered glass, just a steady step toward peace. One afternoon, I bumped into Lorraine from the poetry group while buying wool yarn at the corner shop. She asked how I was doing, and I told her, truthfully, that I was better than I had been in years. I told her that my heart no longer waited for apologies, that my nights no longer ended in tears, and that my mornings had become beautiful again. She nodded and said, "You've become the woman they never expected you to be." I carried that with me all the way home. Back at the house, I sat by the fire with a fresh cup of chamomile and opened the drawer where I had stored Carter's letter. The one where he asked me to drop it, where he called me dramatic, where he defended his cruelty without an ounce of remorse. I reread it slowly, not to relive the hurt, but to measure how far I had come from the woman who once trembled after reading it. This time I folded it neatly and walked it out to the fireplace. I held it over the flames, watched the edges curl, then blacken, then rise as gray dust into the chimney and vanish into the sky. I hadn't needed that letter for closure. I only needed to see that it no longer held power over me. As the sun began to set, casting the room in soft amber, I stood at the window and looked out at the lake. Snow blanketed the trees, and the world looked softer somehow. Not kinder, perhaps, but more honest. I realized, standing there with my hand resting against the window pane, that everything I had once feared losing had already been taken from me long ago. What I had now was not what remained, but what I had reclaimed. I didn't need to hear Carter say he was sorry. I didn't need Marlene to come back and try to explain what she had allowed. Their silence, their distance, they were no longer wounds. They were boundaries, and they were mine. In this new life, I have found a rhythm that no longer includes waiting for redemption from people who do not value it. I have planted herbs by the kitchen window, restored my sewing machine, and signed up to teach reading at the local senior center. I have joined a group of women who meet every Sunday at the bakery down the hill, where we drink coffee too strong and laugh more freely than we ever did in our marriages or our families. I am no longer angry. That emotion burned out in the fire of disappointment long ago. What I feel now is something far more powerful. Not freedom in the way people throw the word around, but freedom in its truest form. The kind that lives in your bones when you know that you owe no one an explanation for choosing peace over proximity. And so I leave you with this, not a tale of revenge, nor of victory in the traditional sense, but a quiet affirmation that you do not need to be loved by those who hurt you to feel whole. That walking away does not mean weakness, it means wisdom. If this story touched a part of your heart, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, I welcome you to stay a while longer. Subscribe to this little corner where stories like mine find their voice. Leave a comment if you wish, or simply carry this story with you, as I now carry my own, not as a wound, but as a scar that no longer stings. This was Edith, a grandmother, a woman reborn beside a lake that once threatened to drown her, and now reflects only her strength. Thank you for listening. Be kind to yourself. I'll be here when the next story finds its way home.